I wasn't sure whether someone was going to introduce me, but I've got a feeling I'm just here on my own and going for it. And I want to talk about three poems and their relation to Edward Vere and his relation to music. I don't think that it's anyone present at the moment is unaware that Edward de Vere was a fantastical poet, very much admired in his day, playwright, and a generous sponsor of scholarship, music, and literature. He was a child prodigy whose infancy, I'm quoting from Arthur Golding, whose infancy from the beginning was ever sacred to the muses. And as a young man was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth, who revelled in his lively dancing and commended him to foreign potentates, not in the usual way, I'm quoting from Elizabeth here, not in the usual way, but from my heart on account of his outstanding intellect and virtue. He was the youngest man of his generation to be honoured by both Oxford and Cambridge universities, and his deep knowledge of ancient history, geography, foreign languages, astronomy, and music is praised by many of his contemporaries. In 1584, the poet John Sauterne, I think possibly coming from the French word sauterne, I'm not sure, trumpeted his silver pen, I quote, and art, for which Sauterne insists he deserves eternal fame. For who marketh better than he, Sauterne writes, the seven turning flames of the sky, or hath read more of the antique, hath greater knowledge in the tongues, or understands sooner the sounds of the learner to love music. Vere was remembered by the composer John Farmer for his, I quote, great affection and judgment in music, and Farmer elsewhere wrote to him stating, for without flattery be it spoke, those that know your lordship know this, that using this science, i.e. music as a recreation, your lordship hath overgone most of them that make it a profession. It is not known which musical instruments Vere played, but lute, recorder, and virginals are all very likely. Shakespeare displays intimate technical knowledge of the sound and workings of each of these instruments in his plays and poems. Vere chose his servants from among those who could play, sing, act, write poetry, or compose music, very like a character in a play by Richard Broome, who boasts how all his servants, however good they are at laying the table, they're also wonderful at playing on the viol or the oboe. Vere had, for instance, the actor-playwrights John Lilly and Anthony Mundy on his staff. Henry Locke, a poet servant who worked for Vere for over 20 years, revealed how all of his servants, and I quote, tasted of his liberality by gift or procurement of land, lease, or permanent gift of his own estates by his procurement, or in clothes and money. Remember that Vere was fantastically generous. We know that the most successful composer of his day, William Byrd, received from Vere the lease on Battles Hall in Essex, and that the great lutenist Robert Hales received an annuity of £20 out of, quote, the issues and profits of his lands, tenements, and hereditaments in Essex. Byrd wrote the Earl of Oxford's March, also known as March Before the Battle, and I wonder sometimes whether there's any little joke going on there concerning Battles Hall. In April 1576, Vere brought back with him from Venice a brilliant young chorister whom he had heard singing at the Church of Santa Marina in order that he might sing before the Queen and the court at Westminster. So clearly he was very transported when he heard this boy singing in Italy. Now, if I may, I should like to read Vere's earliest statement on music, 3 verses from a poem of 4 written before he was 17 years old as a song lyric called In Commendation of Music. You may recognize the first 3 lines because they are quoted in Act 4, Scene 5 of Romeo and Juliet, prompting a comic conversation between 3 musicians bearing names associated with musical instruments, James Soundpost, Simon Catling, and Hugh Rebeck. A rebec is an early form of violin, catling, a lute string, and soundpost, a peg connecting the inside, front, and back of a stringed instrument. So here's the poem, or the 3 verses of it I'm going to read you. When griping griefs the heart would wound, and doleful dumps the mind oppress, there music with her silver sound is wont with speed to give redress of troubled mind, for every sore sweet music hath a salve therefore. In joy it makes our mirth abound, in grief it cheers our heavy sprites. The careful head released hath found by music's pleasant sweet delights. Our senses, that should I say more, are subject unto music's law. A heavenly gift that turns the mind, like as the stern doth rule the ship. O music, whom the gods assigned to comfort man, whom cares would nip. Sith thou both man and beast doth move, what wise man then will thee reprove? Now, I've heard an awful lot of tripe spoken about the rottenness of Edward de Vere's verses written when he was 15 or 16, but I would be very proud and excited if my son or myself or anyone else I knew could write a poem as pretty and delightful as that as a teenager. Now, that poem, just for your interest, was wrongly ascribed to Master Edwards in the 1576 edition of Paradise of Dainty Devices. That went through a number of editions and they cleared up a lot of the mistakes in ascription. So Edward's name was removed from all 8 editions that followed between 1578 and 1606. And we know that that poem was by Edward de Vere, not just because those of us who know enough about his poems can hear very clearly the unique ring of his voice in the poem, but because there is a manuscript copy of that poem which is subscribed Ball. And Ball was a poesy type of pseudonym used by Vere. And we know that because there are other manuscripts signed Ball, 3 of them in fact, which have also contemporary manuscripts telling us that those poems are by Oxford. If Fortune May Enforce, which is in the Coningsby Harleian collection, Who Taught Thee First to Sigh, which also has a manuscript written Earl of Oxford underneath it, in Finnet's Miscellany, and My Mind to Me, A Kingdom Is, in the Harvard folio, is ascribed to Vere and elsewhere to Ball. So we have 3 different witnesses that the Ball poems are in fact Edward de Vere's. Now, I have no real idea why he signed himself Ball, and if anyone does have ideas, I'd be very grateful to hear from you, and you can write comments about it. Could it be to do with the O of Oxford is like a ball? I don't know. Could it be something to do with rings? Who knows? But your ideas would be greatly welcomed. Moving on, My Mind to Me, A Kingdom Is. So that's one of the Ball poems that is also ascribed to Vere in an early manuscript. It's often thought to be a sort of almost a joke poem, a light poem about a man who's got a lofty mind who thinks he's above worldly cares. It begins, My mind to me a kingdom is, such perfect joy therein I find, that it excels all other bliss that world affords or grows by kind, though much I want, which most would have, yet still my mind forbids to crave. I won't read the whole poem to you because I think so many of you know it already, and anyway, it's going to be sung for you later on. But the point of that poem, and I played it on the piano just a moment ago, the point of it really is that it's actually a deeply religious poem. He is taking his ideas from Matthew 6:33, where Jesus says, don't lay up for yourself treasures on earth, don't worry about food and drink and clothes, seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. How do you seek the kingdom of God? Where do you seek it? Well, you only have to turn to Luke 17, obviously an important number for Edward de Vere. And Jesus says, the kingdom of God cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, look here or look there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. That's what this poem is about. And of course, it draws heavily as well from Hermes Trismegistus. And there's a lot of very exciting Oxfordian research being done at the moment, showing these links between Hermetic thought, Hermes, and Shakespeare. And Hermes Trismegistus says, he writes, God shows himself freely to all, not where as in place, or how as through some quality, or how much as in quantity, but by illuminating people with the understanding that comes only through mind. There is nothing more godlike than mind. So you can see where he's coming from. Now, this is a conference about music. So back to music. William Byrd wrote that piece, and William Byrd fully understands that this poem is about the kingdom of God and about the connection of the poet's mind to God. We know this because just as in poems, there's a lot of numeric symbolism goes on, so does it in music of this age. And this song, My Mind to Me, A Kingdom Is entirely built around the number of divine perfection, that is the number 3. Each measure contains 3 whole notes, or semi-breves as we now call them. They were known as whole notes then. And there are in all 27 measures, which is 3 times 3 times 3, 3 cubes. And the melodic content is constructed of layered thematic motives of 3 notes each, which are repeated 3 times to form a set 3 times 3, while sets themselves are grouped into 3s, bringing us back to this 3 times 3 times 3, represented by the 27 measures and the 3 triangles of the sonnet's dedication. I haven't time to tell you now, but if we have a question and answer, I'll point it out, that Vere himself in the poem is using numbers in an extraordinary way. He has each verse contain 48 syllables, and there are 48 lines, and that has meaning as the relation of Vere to God. But 3 is what Bird is playing on, in line with these sayings that we hear so much in those days: tria sunt omnia, 3s are all, or as James says in his epistle, tres testimonium dant, 3s give testimony, or omne trinum perfectum est, all things in 3s are perfect. So finally, to a poem written later in life that praises the combination of music and poetry, comparing it to his friendship with R.L., one R.L. which William Covell in Polymantia of 1595 cryptically reveals to be none other than that Rose Lily Rosalie Henry, 3rd Earl of Southampton. We are very honoured to have our revered patron, Derek Jacobi, to read it for us in just a moment. First, if I may, a few quick remarks about it. The sonnet was first published in The Passionate Pilgrim as by William Shakespeare. We know not when, as there is no extant title page on the unique first edition copy, but probably around 1596, 1597. After that, it reappeared in the 2 subsequent editions of Passionate Pilgrim in 1599 and 1612, as well as among a group of Shakespeare-related poems in a 1598 pamphlet called Poems in Diverse Humours, possibly a pun, I think it probably was a pun, Poems in De Vere's Humours, with an implied ascription to Richard Barnfield. Now, in the Barnfield edition, the poem is entitled To His Friend Master R.L. in praise of music and poetry, and contains several clues that it was in fact written not by Barnfield or by William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, but by Vere. In the last line, for instance, the poet describes himself as a knight, which makes both William of Stratford and Richard Barnfield unlikely authors. Oxford, obviously, as we all know, is often described in this way, most notably by Thomas Nash in 1596, when he writes of that honourable knight about court yet attending, to whom I wish no better fortune than the forelocks of fortune he had hold of in his youth, and no higher fame than he hath purchased himself by his pen, being the first in our language I have encountered that repurified poetry from art's pedantism, and that instructed it to speak courtly. Our patron, our Phoebus, our first Orpheus, or quintessence of invention he is. The second clue I want you to listen out for when Derek reads it is nestled in what the poet says about Spenser. To me, he writes, Spenser's deep conceit, i.e. his rare device, needs no defence. Now, this seems to refer to a verse conversation written between Spenser and Vere in the paratexts of the first edition of the Faerie Queene in 1590, in which Spenser writes to Vere, saying that he, quote, doth crave to be defended by Vere from envy's poisonous bite. Vere responds in a poem subscribed ignoto, meaning the unknown, stating that Spenser needs, quote, no defense, as his rare device is such that any defense would only cause him to be envied, not prevent the envy. And as many of us know, that little poem has echoes in Johnson's remarks about Shakespeare in the first folio of 1623. And finally, to switch from the third person in the title to his friend, Master R.L., to the first person in the poem itself, and I in deep delight, and I the other, allows for the possibility that Barnfield plonked this poem by Vere into a short anthology of his own poems to make a point. And that point, by the way, is only properly made by reading the first 4 poems in succession. the fourth being Shakespeare's As It Fell Upon a Day.